Welcome back. So great to see you all again, and I'm so excited to continue this conversation. This is the most important time in U.S. China relations in the last 30 years, and we are here to continue this conversation because we believe that you knowing what we know is really important for thinking about this. Now, just again, to give you a little bit of background on me, if you listened to our first podcast, you've heard this already, so I won't go into details about me, but just so you know, so I'm Doug Guthrie. I'm the founder and chairman of On Global Leadership. I'm also a professor of global management and the executive director of China initiatives at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. And I work in close collaboration with the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, Arizona, and the Asian American Culture of Art and Association of Arizona. And so we all are working together to think deeply about U.S.-China relations and what it means for the world today, right? And we're building this conversation here in Phoenix. Who would have thought 30 years ago that we'd be having this conversation about U.S.-China relations and Phoenix being the ground zero for U.S.-China relations in Phoenix? I wouldn't have known it. When I was a kid, my grandfather was a professor at Arizona State University, and so I grew up coming to Phoenix in the 1970s in the summers, and I thought ASU, I didn't think about it as a core place for U.S.-China relations and U.S.-China relations conversations, but Phoenix is ground zero right now for how we think about these issues. And so today, what we're going to talk about is a really important set of issues. So again, we're building on our conversation from the past of this being the most important moment in U.S.-China relations in the last 30 years, and Phoenix being the ground zero for these conversations. But in this specific podcast, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about technology. And we're going to talk about a couple of different companies, right? And so I'm going to draw a little bit on my own experience. I'm going to talk about Apple in China. So U.S.-China relations, how to relate to technology companies, Apple in China. I was the head of Apple University in China and helped Tim Cook negotiate his situation under Xi Jinping. And so, I can talk about that. I have a collaborator, and she used to work with me at Apple, and now she works at TikTok. And so I'm going to talk about TikTok in the United States. And then we're going to talk about TSMC in China, or in Phoenix, okay? So these are the core issues that we want to talk about right here. I'm just going to break them down and run through them very quickly. But the key thing that I want you to understand, here again, U.S.-China relations, we can think about the Beijing-Washington consensus and how are they navigating what the world should be. No. What I think this has to be is about local economic development between cities. So, as I mentioned in the last podcast, who's the sister city of Phoenix? Chengdu. Who's the sister city of Tempe? Zhenjiang. What are we talking about in terms of economic development? But more important than that is what are the economic relationships of specific companies that are operating in these plateaus, right? And so this is really, really important. And, I mentioned my personal narrative in the last podcast, and so I won't go deep into it again, but as you all might remember, I grew up as a China scholar, and I was the dean of business school at George Washington University for a while. I've always been about solidifying ties between the United States and China. And then, as I was exiting from my deanship, I got a call from Joel Podolny, who was the dean of Apple University, and Tim Cook, who was the CEO of Apple at the time, and they said, why don't you come join us and help us think about this issue? This was in 2014, so if you all will remember this moment. So Xi Jinping came to power on March 14th, 2013. He was inaugurated. March 15th, 2013 was Consumer Day. And which company was called out? Apple. Right? So CCTV kind of made the claim that Apple's a bad player, bad behavior, blah, blah, blah. And most of the Apple executives at that time, I thought, were just, they sort of dismissed it. They said, like, okay, we modified our issues, we dealt with it, we're fine. But as I was watching this, and this was, right before I started getting the calls and was in conversation with Joel Pedoni and Tim Cook, I thought something was wrong. I thought they weren't getting it, right? And so when I was leaving my deanship and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next, I said, okay, send me to China. I'll work with you guys. I'll think about this. And this was a really, really important moment because it helped me understand, as somebody who studied manufacturing supply chains and studied joint venture relationships, it helped me understand what it meant to think about Apple's presence in China, and particularly its presence in the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao era. So this is an interesting thing about Apple. So Apple entered China in 2001, right? And I think, just for the record, I think Tim Cook is a business genius. The reason Apple is the most profitable and most valuable company in the world, Steve Jobs, love his vision, amazing, but it's not because of Steve. It was because of Tim. This guy's a genius. And he is the person who took Apple into China. And he took Apple into China in 2001 under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. And so he saw it. He was an ops specialist. And my God, like, this guy understood the world. He was amazing. And so when I joined Apple, I was like, I was somebody who had studied joint ventures and manufacturing supply chains in China, and I was suddenly under the person who was the greatest genius in the world in manufacturing supply chains, right? And so Tim built Apple's presence in China under the manufacturing supply chain. But when people like J.D. Vance and others say, oh, my goodness, China's stealing our jobs because of cheap labor, that's not what's happening. What's happening in China is that China has built the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chains by investing in industrial clusters and building a intellectual, and it's sort of a sub-tier intellectual manufacturing supply chain of managers who are operating in the manufacturing supply chain that manage the migrant labor force. It's an amazing system. What they've done is amazing, right? And so, I think that China deserves credit for that. But the important thing is you can't just transplant that to places like India. Okay, so Foxconn built a plant in Chennai. Great, we're all good. We can just move iPhone production to Chennai. Foxconn is just a final assembly plant, right? But Apple relies on 1,600 supplier partners that are operating on developing all of the small scale products that lead to final assembly, right? And so, and the reason, here's my favorite statistic of Apple. So Apple controls about 30% of the smartphone market share in the world, right? What percentage of the profits do you think they take in the smartphone segment? People guess. 30, 40, 50? No, 96. Right? 96% of the profits go to Apple. Why is that? That's because what Apple has developed in China is they've built these industrial clusters that are all tied to competing for Apple supply chain managers on building very effective and efficient manufacturing supply chains. So Apple ops engineers all sleep in manufacturing supply chain partners on the supply lines when a spike in iPhone production is happening. And then they're willing to give Apple production for free, zero margins, so that they can go make their money from Huawei, Xiaomi, Samsung, all of the other competitors, right? And so that's why Apple takes 96% of the profits in the smartphone market segment. So the question is, like, could Apple just go produce in India? No. It would take 40 years to develop that manufacturing supply chain. It's just not. So Apple is married to China, right? And so it's a really, really important moment to understand, like, we're married. Apple is married to China. Tesla is married to China with a very special relationship that it has. And I'm not an expert in the segment of the population that Tesla is operating in, but like Tesla and BYD are competing, and but Tesla is married to China, Apple is married to China, and Walmart is married to China. Walmart is the single largest exporter from China to the United States. Like, we're all here together. So then the question is, like, so what are we doing? And I think what we need to do is we need to break down this idea of the Beijing Washington narrative. Like, and I'll just say personally, it's a little embarrassing for me when people like Janet Yellen go over and give a speech in Guangzhou and like wave her finger and say, like, oh, you're dumping products, like, you're oversupplying the world market. If you look at the data on what China has done innovatively, but also in terms of supplying the world market in photovoltaic arrays and solar panels, China has done more than any other country in the world, including the United States, in developing the intellectual and industrial supply chains around these issues. And so I'm just, I'm very bullish on what China has done, but I want the United States to eat a little bit of humble pie and think like what we need to do in being clear on these issues. Okay, so that's Apple in China and photovoltaic arrays. TikTok in the United States. This is a complicated issue, right? So there are lots of people who are claiming that ByteDance is owned by the Chinese government. It's not. ByteDance is 60% owned by foreign investors. Probably, I don't know, haven't seen the numbers recently, but about 40% owned by Sequoia Capital, right? Like, this is not a Chinese company. This is a company that is heavily invested by U.S. investors, right? And so the idea that suddenly, oh my goodness, TikTok is creating all of this data and flowing that data back to the Chinese government so the Chinese government can influence what we're doing in the United States, to me it's just ridiculous. I'm stunned that that's the narrative. However, what I think needs to happen is that companies like TikTok and Huawei, they have gotten onto the Washington think tank approach and lobbying approach, and I don't think it's the right approach. What I think these companies need to do is they need to be more investing in local governments like Phoenix, like ASU, and being thought leaders in these areas. And so yes, it's true that companies like TikTok are influencing many, many millions of 13-year-olds around the world. But the important thing is that they are engaging in a way that is responsible, and they're not feeding this data back to the Chinese government. I just don't believe it. I know a number of people in that space, and I just think it's not right. The final piece that I'll mention here is TSMC in Phoenix. Again, this is probably the most important industrial development in the world right now, right? So like if you think about chip manufacturing and like where that's happening, we have Apple in China, and that's really important. We have social media flowing from China to the United States, and that's important. And then we have the semiconductor industry. Wow. And what TSMC is doing, I'm not an expert in microchips, right? But the fact that TSMC is here, the fact that Intel is here, the fact that NVIDIA is thinking about being here, these are major moments for all of us. And so I think it's just a really important time. And so I want us to all think about, like, you know, these are the big questions, the big companies, right? Like Apple in China, TikTok in the United States, TSMC in Phoenix, like, wow. And this is a good moment, right? Like, let's think about U.S. China relations not as the Beijing-Washington consensus, but like Kate Gallego and, you know, whoever she's working with in China. Like, wow, this is a great moment. And let's all put our heads together and think about how to make this the best moment in the elevation of U.S. China relations. Thank you. So in the next part, I'm going to talk about tariffs. I get so upset when we think very superficially about tariffs, and it's going to be a shorter segment, but I want to talk a little bit about what it means for thinking about U.S. China relations. And in segment 4, I'm going to talk about cultural exchange. Thank you. See you next time.